Good afternoon or good morning, depending on your time zone. My name is Claire Weston. I'm the Program Associate for the Center for Creative Land Recycling. We're just going to wait a couple more minutes for a few more people to join, and then we're going to get started. All right, it is 1 o'clock and we have a lot to cover today, so we're going to go ahead and get started. As I said, my name is Claire Weston. I'm the Program Associate at the Center for Creative Land Recycling. I am really excited to be speaking with Alan Mallach today. He is the author of The Divided City, Poverty and Prosperity in Urban America. And today we are going to be discussing our webinar, A Tale of Two Cities, Identifying Inequities and Spurring Revival in America's Legacy Cities. This is the second webinar in our Brown Bag Brunch webinar series. If you think that's a little bit of a mouthful like I do, our B3 series for short. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with the Center for Creative Land Recycling, I do just want to give you a quick introduction of us. Our mission is to promote the sustainable, equitable, and responsible reuse of underutilized and environmentally impacted properties. We educate, advocate, assist, and convene stakeholders to revitalize communities through land recycling. So we're going to be talking a lot more about that in today's webinar and how that relates to Alan's book. I do encourage you all to follow us on social media. We are active on Facebook, LinkedIn, and Twitter. Now, CClear was in overdrive in 2019 with the delivery of an in-person and online training to a record-breaking number of municipalities across the country, a visible leadership role on the national stage, and expanded partnerships and corporate support, showing that land reuse is a team effort, which is something we will be talking about at length today. I want to send out a special thank you and shout out to the American Planning Association Upstate New York chapter for assisting us in accrediting this webinar. AICP certified planners who complete this webinar can receive one certification maintenance credit. You should report those credits the same way you would for a live event through their APA CM log. Now, I just want to get into a couple housekeeping items before we really dive into content. Please keep in mind that there are no visuals for this webinar. So if we are stuck on the same slide for almost the full duration of this webinar, that is intentional. We will engage in a dialogue, Alan and I, for about 30 minutes, and then we'll open it up for questions from you for the last half an hour or so. This webinar is being recorded. You will receive a recording one day after the webinar concludes. You can also access the webinar as well as any supporting materials at our webinar archives page at cclear.org/webinar archives. We also really appreciate and depend on your feedback, so please respond to the survey following the webinar. I do want to take a moment to discuss how to ask questions and engage in this webinar because it is a critical function of this format. So as always, you can ask questions using the questions box on your GoToWebinar dashboard. That's highlighted with the orange or yellow circle on the screen here. If you'd like to personally ask Alan a question out loud, radio style, then you can submit your question using the questions box with the text out loud before your question. Please note that when I unmute you so that you may ask your question, there's going to be a little robotic voice that'll let you know that you're unmuted. So just, be ready for that. I will call you out by saying something along the lines of, we have a question from John Smith. Go ahead, John. And then you can ask your question. If you'd prefer that I read off your question, I totally understand. You just don't put out loud in front of your question, and I'll just read it as written. If you pose a question and we are unable to address it in the allotted time, then no worries. We will respond to those questions over the next week. Alan will be helping us with that, and we will get back to you. It should come as no surprise during this current health crisis that cyberspace is a little bit saturated with online learning opportunities, so it is possible that we will encounter technical difficulties. It happens. If the broadcast is interrupted or you're having trouble connecting, please download the technical difficulties and audio help document that is located in your control document handouts tab. Also check your chat box and your email for further instructions from us. Reminder, there's no visuals, so this isn't such much of an issue, but you can download the presentation that I'm giving right now in that same handout section. In the unlikely event that we are unable to continue the broadcast entirely, we will sign off and the webinar will be rescheduled for tomorrow at 3:30 Eastern Standard Time. You will all receive a registration link in your email directly. Now, let's dive in. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Alan Mallach. Alan has been engaged as a practitioner, scholar, and advocate with the challenges of rebuilding America's cities and their neighborhoods for over 50 years. His current work focuses on urban and neighborhood revitalization in the Rust Belt and the uneven effects of urban revival on lower-income residents and communities of color, a subject that he addresses in his latest book, The Divided City, which we'll be discussing today. A senior fellow with the Center for Community Progress in Washington, D.C., he also teaches in the Graduate Center on Planning and the Environment at Pratt Institute in New York. Welcome, Alan. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, Claire, I'm delighted to be here. Looking forward to this.
Yeah, me too. I think we've got a lot to cover and there's a lot of interest. So let's dive in. Alan, one thing that struck me in reading your book was this idea of two cities. And I'm hoping that you can read a little bit from your book to get us started in this conversation.
Sure. This is the first couple of pages in the introduction. Okay. Something very important and exciting is happening in America's cities. It's not just happening in a few hot coastal cities like New York and Seattle, but is spread to a host of older industrial cities in the nation's heartland, places like Baltimore, St. Louis, and Detroit. Well-educated young millennials are flocking to these cities in unprecedented numbers. Areas like Harbor East in Baltimore and Washington Avenue in St. Louis are throbbing with energy and excitement. In St. Louis, a new apartment building called the Orion has just opened in the city's Central West End neighborhood, a neighborhood once on the shabby side, but now Tony. It has a Whole Foods on the ground floor, and the rent for the top of the line apartments is over $5,000 a month, which is a lot more than the average St. Louis family earns in a month. But people are moving to St. Louis and paying these rents. Downtowns are coming back to life. Hundreds of one-time office buildings, warehouses, and factories have been converted into apartments and condominiums. New stores, restaurants, and night spots are opening up. Only a few years ago, Woodward Avenue, Detroit's main drag, was deserted after 5 p.m. Now it's bustling with life and activity well into the night. The factories are gone, but universities and medical centers are creating thousands of new jobs. Pittsburgh's Carnegie Mellon University and the University of Pittsburgh are spinning off tech startups and cutting-edge self-driving car research. Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, and Baltimore have become global tourist destinations. This isn't happening everywhere. Some of these cities are doing a lot better than others, and small cities like Flint or Dayton are still struggling. But for a lot of cities, once all but given up for dead by politicians and pundits, the cities that people are starting to call America's legacy cities, the last 15 or 20 years have seen a remarkable transformation. It adds up to a complex, exciting, but deeply troubling picture. The revival is real. Across the United States, people no longer see cities as a problem, but as places of opportunity and vitality. The mere idea that tens of thousands of talented young people, in many respects the best and brightest of their generation, would actively choose to live in cities like Baltimore, St. Louis, or Pittsburgh is exciting, particularly for those of us who can remember how city after city fell apart during the 60s and 70s as neighborhoods burnt down and millions fled. Yet the excitement is badly tarnished by the reality that in the process, these cities are turning into places of growing inequality, increasingly polarized between rich and poor, white and black, with unsettling implications for their present and their future. Some areas have rebounded strongly from the mortgage bust in the Great Recession, but others are falling further behind. A few neighborhoods have been revived or gentrified, but others have become poorer and more dilapidated. In St. Louis, it's only a short walk from the glittering Central West End to block after block of poverty, abandoned houses, and vacant lots. Cities have more rich people in rich neighborhoods and more poor ones, but fewer and fewer in the middle. Thousands of new jobs have been created, but fewer of the city's residents are working. Housing prices have risen faster than incomes, and tenants face crushing rent burdens. The median tenant spent 30% of their income for rent in Baltimore in 2000. By 2015, that had risen to nearly 40%. When mayoral candidate Bill de Blasio described New York City in 2013 as a place that has become a tale of two cities, he could have been speaking about any large city in the United States.
Thank you, Alan. That's a poignant start, and that's why I wanted to start there with our discussion. So that last quote, what Mayor de Blasio said about any city in the United States being fitting that quote of a tale of two cities. I'm hoping you can expand on what you mean by the two cities, by a tale of two cities. What's happening to these cities, and what are we seeing here with their revival as well as their decline?
What's happening is that they are both reviving and declining at the same time. You look at any of these cities, you'll see some areas where there is amazing revival. Investment, housing prices going up, new jobs being created, young people moving in. At the same time, in those same cities, and usually very close to one another, you'll see more and more places that are losing ground or are stuck at the bottom, and more people who are losing ground and stuck on the bottom. And it's not just what's appalling. It's not just that large parts of these cities' populations are not benefiting from the revival that's happening a few blocks or half a mile or a mile away. But at the same time as that revival is going on, huge parts of these cities are actually becoming poorer. More houses are being abandoned, fewer people are working. So what we've got is a process of just increasing polarization. And the tragic, perhaps inevitable given America's history, the tragic aspect of this is this polarization is simultaneously economic and racial. The people who are benefiting, the people who are flocking in, tend to be disproportionately white. The people who are losing ground and the neighborhoods that are losing ground tend to be disproportionately black.
Okay, I think that lays out the problem well, and I want to dive a little bit more into the decline, because I think we spend a lot of time thinking about the revival, and the revival that we see can sometimes obstruct what's going on with the decline. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about the factors involved with the decline. What social factors are at play here?
Well, first, I think you're absolutely right. I think people tend to focus on the revival far more. If you were to listen to the media, you would believe that almost every urban neighborhood in the United States is gentrifying. And actually, if you go to most of these cities, now obviously Washington, D.C., San Francisco, these are exceptions. If you go to most American cities, far fewer neighborhoods are gentrifying than are either stuck or declining. And what's going on is that the cities are they're very spatially polarized. Gentrification and revival tend to be concentrated in a few very small areas, which are usually either the downtown and right around it, or where there's a separate center of higher education and healthcare, like the Johns Hopkins campus in Baltimore around that campus. Most of the rest of the city is seeing very little of this. And then you look at some of the other factors that are going on. I mean, one of the interesting things, all of these cities were industrial powerhouses, whether it was Detroit, Baltimore, Cleveland, Cincinnati. These were all cities that were basically about manufacturing. That's gone. That's almost completely disappeared from most of these cities. What they now have instead is an economy that's based predominantly on what are known as eds and meds: higher education, healthcare, especially large-scale healthcare. And what that means is that the history of really good jobs for working class people has disappeared. And increasingly, the people who work in the new growing sectors don't even live in the city. 3/4 of the people who work in Pittsburgh, who have jobs in Pittsburgh, don't live in Pittsburgh. And the same is true pretty much everywhere else. And the people who live in the city have a harder time making ends meet.
Mm-hmm.
So the middle, a big part of this is the middle is disappearing. I mean, if you go back 50, 60, 70 years, most neighborhoods in American cities were middle-income neighborhoods. There were a couple of pockets of rich people and some very poor areas. Today, we have more poor areas, we have more rich areas. There's less and less in the middle. And most of the middle neighborhoods, especially the African-American ones, are moving down, not up.
Yeah. So that's thank you, Alan. And you know, one thing that struck me in your book was sort of this hard pill to swallow, that not every community, as you say, will experience revival, at least not in the traditional sense that, especially us in the land reuse sector, think of as revival. And I was wondering if you could expand on that a little bit. What does that mean, that they won't all necessarily experience revival? And what does it mean to improve the quality of life for those communities that may not fit that revival bill? And how especially can land reuse practitioners play a role in that process?
That's critical. These are two key issues. The first thing is, if you look at cities that have revived, they're cities that typically have a really major higher education and healthcare economic base. For example, in Pittsburgh, University of Pittsburgh Medical Center, which is the largest private sector employer in the state of Pennsylvania. 1 out of every 6, I think, residents of the city of Pittsburgh is a full-time college student. I mean, this is driving Pittsburgh's revival. Now, there aren't an awful lot of cities that have this kind of thing. Now, some cities may have something else going for them. You know, New York City has finance. Silicon Valley has tech. But if you don't have that economic base and you've lost your manufacturing, there's not an awful lot that you can do to revive. Yes, you're going to have little pockets. You know, there'll be one place, maybe 2 places downtown where you can get a latte. But you're not going to see the revival because you need an economic base to revive. Now, that doesn't mean that there's no hope, and it doesn't mean you're going to disappear. But what it means is you have to start thinking very differently around what your future is going to look like. And you really have to focus on 2 key things. And these are critically important for every city, but they're particularly important where you don't have a self-sustaining revival going on. One is, how do you make sure that you can provide a decent quality of life for the people who live in that city? Minimally decent housing, decent neighborhoods, safety, environmental health. And secondly, how do you provide those people with the opportunity to build their human capital? Now, even if some of them then decide to move in order to take advantage of their new skills and training, overall, that's a plus. But if you don't focus on people and their quality of life and their ability to maximize their human capital, these small cities, these struggling industrial towns, these places, really, those are the only cards they have to play, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it'll change in the future, and I hope it does. But you've got to focus on the people.
Absolutely. Point well taken. That's an excellent segue to the next topic that I want to explore. And that's the local approach versus the federal approach, which is something that you speak a little bit about.
Mm-hmm.
And I especially want to touch on why the local and regional approach, as you say, is so key to successful revitalization.
Okay, and I'll start out by saying I'm never going to say that the federal government is irrelevant. In the final analysis, as we're seeing today, in fact, the federal government is the only actor in the entire system that has the financial resources to significantly change the whole financial and resource picture, whether it has to do with providing people with decent housing, filling the gap for unemployment or healthcare, or any of these fundamental necessities of life. But at the same time, I think somebody once said that all money does is provide money. It doesn't tell you how you use the money. It doesn't tell you what the priorities are going to be or how the funds are going to be used or anything of the sort. Now, all of that is local. What a city does, what a state does, what all the communities in a region do is determined by the people who are living and working and making the decisions in those communities. And if anybody who is concerned about what's going on locally thinks that the federal government is going to come in like the old-fashioned cavalry and straighten everything out for them, they are totally mistaken. The only way change can happen in a community is if the people who share in the decision-making process in this community, which is another way of saying the people who have power in the community, come together around a commitment to change. Now, the thing is, once they've done that, we find, except for a couple of key areas, it's not really about the money. Or put it differently, it's not really about finding more money. And I'll give you two quick examples. One is we spend a lot of money in education. We don't spend most of it wisely. But if you go around the country, and I've spent a lot of time, when I was working on this book, I spent a lot of time traveling and talking to people, especially about education and about workforce development, because those were two areas I didn't know enough about when I started writing. And what I found, the schools that are taking kids from the toughest environments and giving them real opportunity in life aren't any more expensive than a lot of schools that are just warehouses. When it comes to training people and taking people, again, people who are, tough, and getting them so that they can get and hold decent jobs, yes, it's a little bit more expensive than the sort of plain vanilla training programs that you see in most places, but not more expensive in terms of what a local government or certainly a state government can provide than is realistic. This is doable. So the real issue is, how do you pull together the people who have to be pulled together at the local level to make change happen? And that's why it's really, you know, on the one hand, it's easier, but on the other hand, it's a lot harder than a lot of people think, because nobody is going to rescue you. You've got to do it yourself.
Mm-hmm. So that makes me think, Alan, one of the things that we talk a lot about in land reuse is the idea of a redevelopment champion, someone to really take charge and lead this project, whatever that project might be, whatever land reuse or land recycling is happening. And I'm wondering if you can, you talk about a number of what I thought were land reuse champions in your book. I'm wondering if you can talk, maybe give an example of one, maybe YNDC or another one that strikes your fancy.
YNDC is a good example, and there are a couple more, but okay, YNDC, which stands for Youngstown Neighborhood Development Corporation, is one of the most amazing community development corporations in the United States. And they've been around for, I'm guessing, 10 or 12 years now. And now Youngstown is a small city with a very weak economy, thousands of vacant houses and vacant lots, a city government with extraordinarily limited capacity to do anything more than provide the most minimal basic services. So this organization, which was started by a local foundation about, let's say, 10, 12 years ago, it has just filled the gap. And it focuses on the types of physical improvements and others that truly change people's quality of life. So they work in terms of dealing with vacant lots and turning them into productive open space, demolishing dangerous buildings, rehabbing them others, and selling them to working class families, engaging neighborhood after neighborhood in planning their futures. And again, they have not changed the economy in Youngstown. Youngstown is still struggling, but what they have done is they have transformed the quality of life for thousands of people who live in the community and actively engaged all of the people in the community in that process. Mm-hmm. So I think that's a remarkable achievement. And there are groups like that. I mean, Youngstown stands out, but there are groups that are doing amazing work all over the country. In fact, what is amazing when you think about it is how many people are doing really good work, and yet how difficult it seems to be to get traction in terms of going to scale and expanding and replicating these models, because ultimately that's where you're running into the issues of the need to create the kind of coalitions that frankly don't really exist.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, let's talk about that a little bit, because we've talked about some of the problems, but I want to explore some of the solutions, some of the paths forward for municipalities and other community groups in sparking revival in their cities. And you mentioned several times in your book that there's no silver bullet to remediating some of the issues that we've discussed thus far. So what ways can cities tailor their revival strategies to increase their chances of success? And what role specifically can land reuse practitioners play in that process?
Okay, it's interesting. You know, I started looking at these issues very much from as a planner by background, very much from a land use and physical environment. And gradually, as I got deeper and deeper into it, I started seeing that as progressively less of the picture. But I think it's not, no offense, doesn't mean it's irrelevant, but I think it starts out at this, I want to make this point about the need to build real coalitions. The thing about a city, there's nobody, no one person or organization in any city in this country who is in a position to make really major decisions. No mayor, no university president, no foundation CEO. You've got to build that consensus around change and get all of the people around finite number of transformative actions, and they're going to take time. And again, they're not going to be glamorous. They're not going to have a lot of ribbon cuttings and groundbreakings and photo ops and things like that, because ultimately, an awful lot of what change or transformative change is about rebuilding the basic fabric of a community. And I'll mention just a couple of things. I mentioned about quality of life. Maybe not every neighborhood is going to gentrify. In all likelihood, probably most neighborhoods might not want to gentrify. But there is no reason why every neighborhood in a city can't have a basically decent quality of life in terms of people's health and safety. So there's no reason why people can't have an opportunity for a better life through a decent education, decent skill training opportunities, so forth. We know how to do this stuff. These are the things we can build. Another thing, there is no reason why we can't have competent, honest, efficient governance in our cities. But the fact is, when it comes down to it, we're not doing a very good job in most places in any of those three. We don't allow most people, we don't give most people the opportunity to live in a decent neighborhood. We don't give most, or certainly many kids, the opportunity to improve themselves through education. And most of our city governments, well, they're not terrible, but they certainly fall well short of the ideal of being efficient and effective and honest government across the board. So I think those are the critical areas. At that point, land use is an important part of it, because when it comes to certain things are fundamental, like making sure that land use doesn't actually harm you, that people are not exposed to environmental contaminants, that people are not exposed to vacant, unboarded, unsafe buildings or trash-filled vacant lots, that people have a decent physical infrastructure to be part of. I mean, that's kind of fundamental. And then as we build up, I think we can start looking at how do we improve our housing stock, both the existing housing stock and build more good, decent, affordable housing for people. I think all of these are, critical issues that we have to grapple with.
Yeah, thank you, Alan. I think that that makes a lot of sense, but it is painting a little bit of a sort of a hopeless picture. And so I do want to dive into how do we move forward? Like, what are some solutions, some practical, feasible things that municipalities and community groups can do to make a difference? And I also just want to, you mentioned, that a lot of these local governments can be inefficient and ineffective, but I want to know, to what extent are they actually powerless? Are they stymied by the conditions that have been set in that community, and what can they do to sort of, empower themselves?
I don't think they're powerless. I think good leadership, and you can see good leadership, whether it's mayoral leadership, whether it's even below the mayoral level and so forth in local government, can make a big difference. I mean, he's not perfect, but Mike Duggan in Detroit has totally changed the conversation about the future of that city from where it was before he came into office in really fundamental and positive ways. And Michael Braverman, who's the Commissioner of Housing and Community Development in Baltimore, has put in place probably the country's best strategies for getting vacant houses rehabilitated and put back into use. Mm-hmm. I mean, I could go on, but the point is, there are tremendous opportunities for effective, competent leadership, and not as many as I would like, but there are quite a number of people around the country who are doing a really good job in their particular spheres, in their particular communities. So I don't think it's hopeless by any means. I saw their programs. I saw one in Baltimore. I saw another in Minneapolis, so forth. Again, they're doing amazing things in terms of turning the lives around for people who come out of years of incarceration with every conceivable problem, and helping them to get and hold, which is harder, good, well-paying jobs. And so there are a lot of things going on. The key thing, I think, though, is a city can have an impact in a particular area. And being a mayor, that gives you a bully pulpit that can be very powerful. But ultimately, to create the kind of transformative change that is needed in, whether it's in the public schools, whether it's in the training programs, whether it's in the housing policies or the planning process or what have you, that's where you really need to bring what I call, or what the power, the coalition together.
Mm-hmm.
Because in every city has people who essentially, either together or separately, end up making whatever decisions get made. Back 100 years ago, it was the people who were the owners of the big factories who would periodically get together and decide what the city wanted or what the city needed from their standpoint. Today, it's much more fluid. You've got city government, you have institutions, you have the president of the local medical center might just be the most important, most powerful person in some of these cities. And he or she has to be part of the process. The president of the university, the president of the local foundations, the tech people, everybody has to become part of this, because ultimately they all have to be at the table. And the same thing is, every city has any number of organizations and people who care deeply about these issues and want to see change happen. But they too tend to be operating as often as not at cross purposes, or fighting over the crumbs of funding that come down from the city's community development program. They have to get their act together.
Mm-hmm.
So it's part of a process.
It is, yeah. And given what we've discussed thus far, I do want to take a moment, given the current health crisis, to briefly, before we transition to questions. As a reminder, everyone, please send in your questions. We are taking them now, and I'll filter through, and we can start talking about those soon. But before we jump into that, I do want to ask about COVID-19 and the implications of COVID-19 on our urban revival paradigm and priorities, specifically as it relates to housing, open space, and spatial equity.
And you think I was being depressing before?
Oh, no.
No, I'll tell you, I am scared. Not of the pandemic as such, so that's pretty scary, but of the possible fallout that's going to come after we go back to something resembling normal, and issues like the months of rent that people haven't been able to pay, the months of mortgage payments that people haven't been able to make, the months of a depressed housing market, the number of businesses that are not going to be able to reopen, and so forth. When all of these bills become due, I mean, I don't know. There's still a part of me that really hopes that we will have a systematic, thoughtful, and large-scale response from the federal government that could cushion a lot of these problems. But if we don't, then I think we're going to have to work awfully hard to dig ourselves out of this trench that we're going to be in. And I think one of the things that's going to make it even harder is the fact that local governments, which people I think are going to look to for an awful lot of leadership at this moment are going to be in a fiscal bind that is worse, far worse than the fiscal bind they were in during the foreclosure crisis and the Great Recession. I know Mayor Duggan in Detroit has already announced that they're looking at a $300 million shortfall this year, which is over 20% of the city budget. And people are talking about large-scale layoffs, furloughs, and the like. So I think it is going to take absolutely every bit of our resources and our thoughtful intelligence to keep the post-pandemic crisis from becoming a long and grievous recession. I think we can do it, but it is going to be tough.
Okay, yeah, I think what you've said about building a coalition and really coming together as a community is more important now than ever, and I think that's something that we can take from this is that in land reuse and in revival in general, building that coalition to spur progress is essential, wouldn't you say?
We have to get out of our bubbles.
We all out of the bubbles, yep.
We have to get out of them and really understand what each other is going through and how we can work together.
Excellent. Okay, I'm gonna start opening this up for questions. So please, I'm sure you have some thoughts after this discussion. Please send your questions in, and we'll get to as many of them as possible. I'm gonna start out with a question, Alan. Do you believe Andrew Yang's freedom dividend is a realistic solution to help people move from the bottom to the socioeconomic scale?
No. I think the freedom dividend, aka minimum guaranteed income, so forth, it's a potentially useful idea, but it begs two, I think, critical issues. And to begin with, where it's useful, I mean, there are an awful lot of people who are sort of close to or at the bottom for whom a few $1,000s could make a big difference, not in terms of getting into the middle class and not in terms of real opportunity, but just in terms of being a notch above survival. And that's useful, and that's important. But two issues. The first issue is we don't have enough money to create a dividend that's large enough to really change people's life prospects and opportunities in a meaningful way. Number two, and this I think is more serious, it begs a fundamental question about what gives people's lives meaning. And I think the notion, when people start talking to me about if the jobs are lost, but if we have this freedom dividend, then people can focus on hobbies and develop skills and learn foreign languages and so forth. That's educated elite people talking about the rest of the world. And I find that offensive because for most people, it is a job that gives much, not all, but a great deal of the meaning and the purpose in their lives. And you can't replace that with a hobby or with learning Sanskrit in your old age. And I don't think in the final analysis, if we want to have a society that really makes sense for people, we can treat the concept of a job as something that's expendable, even if we had enough money to do so, which we don't.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Our next question here, folks like Mayor Duggan and the Baltimore Housing Director, NGOs can help bite at the edges, quote. What systematic approaches can regions, states, and the feds go to reverse these trends? Climate change mitigation, land use sprawl, unionization, local manufacturing, and renewable energy.
All of them? That's a lot.
Maybe just pick two.
Okay, let me pick out a couple. Okay, climate change is probably one huge issue that is, if there's one issue that is hardest to tackle at the local level, it's probably climate change. Then again, it doesn't mean that there aren't an awful lot of things that cities and regions and even neighborhoods can do to cut their carbon footprint and become more energy self-sufficient and less wasteful, so forth. And all of those things are worthwhile. But ultimately, the large scale macroeconomic global systems, whether it's transportation, whether it's the productive systems of the economy, it's, require not just national, but global action. So I think that's one area. When it comes to other areas, I think renewable energy, again, that's an area, certain things have to be done at the federal, the national level, but other things can be done. I think a lot of states, for example, have provided incentives, have created energy plans and strategies that focus on renewable energy. And I think any city can make a contribution in that respect. At the same time, I think when you look at what cities can do with some of these issues, there's a bit of a bind. Even when a city can do something, if there's a significant cost associated to that, these cities do not have the kind of deep pockets that the federal government has. And the other thing which makes it very difficult is that cities are consciously in a very competitive position with one another and are trying to figure out how to maximize their assets and their advantages, whether it's in terms of getting jobs, drawing affluent young people, drawing investment, and all these kinds of things. And so they're constantly in a balancing act. Again, this is why a lot of these issues really require national and global solutions. But again, cities can do a lot of things. Just one quickly on local manufacturing, I saw that was on the list. Again, I think it's a tragedy that for many decades in the United States, we as a country seem to reach a conclusion that it doesn't matter if we make things or not. I think it's important, and I'm glad to see the pendulum, at least philosophically, is swinging back towards something that makes more sense. At the same time, local manufacturing is not a panacea for anything. And the main reason it isn't is because new manufacturing today is extraordinarily not labor intensive compared to historical manufacturing. And one example, Youngstown pulled off a great coup. They took the site that was a former steel mill, cleaned it up. It was a brownfield, by the way, cleaned it up, got it back into use, and got it into the hands of a French steel company, which built a state-of-the-art steelmaking plant on that site to replace the old one. It's beautiful if you like steel mills. And it probably makes more stuff than the old plant did. The old plant employed 10 to 15,000 people. The new plant employs 350 people, and most of them sit behind consoles, push buttons. It's a different world. It's a world of technology, robotics, computers, and so forth, and the world where manufacturing created hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of jobs which were defined by the brawn that the workers could bring to those jobs is long gone.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you, Alan. Now I have a question from Mary Hashem. She's going to ask that question out loud. So one moment. All right, Mary, I am unmuting you now, and you can ask your question.
Good afternoon, Alan, and thank you very much for sharing your thoughts with us today. I chair the board of CClear, and I would like to ask what advice you might have for us as an organization as we as we deploy federal funding and grants and philanthropic money to help communities, to assist them with land recycling decisions, land planning, and positioning themselves for revival. In many cases, these are small towns with problematic brownfield sites in their communities that they are looking to have as catalyst opportunities for revival. What advice do you have for us as an organization as to how we can best help these communities? Thank you in advance for your answer.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of issues, but I think two things. As far as I certainly wouldn't presume to advise you on the technical aspects of what should be done with the site. And I suspect when it comes to identifying potential uses for revival, I think you probably have something of a handle. So I'll make 2 points. The first is ultimately revival has to be economically self-sustaining based on the marketplace. So I think the key is when one is talking to a town about what kind of reuse is in fact going to lead to revival, is to focus on that issue, and as distinct from, for example, reuses that are essentially dependent on federal subsidy or state subsidy or other kinds of things. They have their place in a larger picture. They can be very important, but ultimately they're not really about revival. But the second and more important point I'd like to make is the key, to me, the key thing, and this is true across almost any type of work at the local level, is to build a kind of a metaphorical equity screen into all of the thinking about what happens to brownfield sites or to in a community's revival. So is the town, as they're thinking about revival, thinking about how this revival can be made inclusive, how the revival can benefit the people who live on the other side of the river in the bombed out neighborhoods, how the revival will, if it's going to create jobs, how those jobs are going to be shared by people who live in the community, how to put together the types of training, for example, that people in the community might need to get those jobs before they become available. And there are a million questions like that. But I think this concept of thinking of it as a virtual equity screen that you use to think through any strategy, any revival effort, so forth, is the most fundamental thing I'd suggest.
Thank you, Alan. That's really helpful, and that's something that we definitely pass on to the people that we work with and provide technical assistance to, because it's critical to spurring equitable revival, and you know, the major part of our mission. So, yeah,
I would, one thing though, I think is really important, and I suspect, you know, I don't know enough about the nuts and bolts of your work to know whether you do this or not. So if you're doing this already, just, you know, disregard. But I think today everybody is talking equity. Which is important and which is good. But the question is, it's one thing to talk it as a general proposition, and it's another thing to bring it down to the ground. And again, if you're doing this already, wonderful. But if not, what you may want to start thinking about is a kind of a pretty detailed checklist or set of issues, questions, elements that, what does equity mean in this particular situation? What does equity mean for a brownfield site that's going to be redeveloped for housing? What does it mean for a brownfield site that can be redeveloped for jobs? What does it mean if the site is in a low income or African American neighborhood versus if it's some other part of the city? So really, in advance, think through all of the ways in which different outcomes, different strategies can affect equity. So it becomes more than a generalized value.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you so much for highlighting that. I want to move on to another question. This one is also going to be asked out loud from Lee Alon. Great question. Just hold on one moment while I pull up your name. All right, Lee, I'm going to unmute you, and you can ask your question yourself. Oh, shoot, you need to enter your PIN. Lee, I'm going to come back to you. Enter your audio PIN so that you can ask your question. All right, I'm going to go to a different question. This one from Gregory Waldman. He states, I think you are right that we need a strong and persistent push from communities and labor, especially since cities will be in a bind. Philadelphia is in a $700 million hole and a $431 million after CARES infusion. What are some demands that the grassroots should make and do you think substantial wins could happen on a national level?
I'm not sure I even want to go to the national level at this point. But let's talk about Philadelphia. I think the most important thing I think advocates can do is to try to identify, and again, this is where if you don't speak with a clear voice and have a manageable set of issues, things tend to get lost in the noise. So that's the first part. But the second is, be real and recognize the existence of competing positions. That you're not going to get everything, and in the final analysis, everybody has to be able to survive somehow. So for example, if you're advocating, as many of my fellow housing advocates have been doing, for just to abolish rents for the duration, don't even go there unless you have a coherent idea of how you're going to enable landlords to stay afloat if they're not going to collect any rents for 6 months. And the same is true, there are hundreds of similar situations. So think about what your key issues are, what your highest priorities are, and recognize that they've got to be balanced, and ultimately the city government, whether it's Mayor Kenny, the city council, the department heads, and so forth, are going to have to engage in a balancing act where nobody ain't going to get everything they want.
Yeah, so it's about being realistic and tackling the problems that are manageable, and not overshooting.
Right, not overshooting, but setting priorities. If you want know what are the 4 things you really can't live without.
Right. Are you asking me?
No, just as a general proposition. No. Your cat, your whatever, I don't know.
Right. Okay. All right, thank you. So I'm going to actually read out loud Lee's question. She's not going to be able to ask it herself. So Lee says, this is a great discussion. I appreciate discussion of the importance of jobs to a person's sense of self and the fact that our economy will no longer need tens of thousands of workers to produce particular goods. So can we take it a step beyond this? How should cities and communities be preparing for the next economy? Who are the thought leaders on this?
Okay. I think, again, when we start talking about preparing for the next economy, it's difficult for a city to do that by itself, because so much about where the next economy goes is going to depend on national issues, and so many of the strategies that have to be in place should be national. And again, I think it's sad that there are so many people around the country who are thinking about these issues, people at universities, people at think tanks, and so forth. The thinking has not permeated the current administration, but the thinking is going on. And I think what we have to be thinking about is, how do we create the kinds of jobs for the work that needs to be done, I think is one of the key issues. I think it is certainly likely that a lot of jobs are going to disappear over the coming decades. I think most people seem to believe that within 5 to 10 years, self-driving vehicles will become pretty much established. And I think both with respect to automobiles, but even more so with respect to the jobs associated with moving things, moving people, moving goods, and so forth, there are going to be huge transformations. I think it's about 4 million people in the United States have jobs moving people, bus drivers, truck drivers, delivery people, cabbies, and so forth. And all of this is going to be a huge shift. And so I think we really have to think very long and hard about the concept of creating jobs and how to do that and how to make it work economically, both in terms of public money and private money, and as well as making the jobs in areas like childcare and education and so forth more stable and more desirable for people. Because I think this clearly we're going to have a shift, and it's going to be a very painful shift. But I think if we need not just local action, but national action to start addressing these issues.
Thank you, Alan, very much. So it is 2 o'clock. There's just one more question which we are going to address, but I do just want to acknowledge that it's 2 o'clock and this is the formal end of the webinar. But if you have the time, we have the time. So we're just going to ask this last question and then we'll close. This question is from Martha Faust, who I am actually going to ask if she can relay the question to you herself. Martha, I am going to unmute you. You are good to go. Nope, I'm the wrong person. There we go. Martha, you are all set.
Hi, this has been a great discussion. I was just wanting to note that I work for Ramsey County Community and Economic Development where St. Paul, Minnesota is located. We are the smallest, most diverse, and most urban of the counties and one of the poorest. And so just thinking about all of the solutions that you've outlined that local governments can help, and we have been working on an equity and economic competitiveness plan since before COVID. We clearly understand, as you've noted, that this health crisis is going to compound all of these issues related to income inequality. So my question was, if you're a local government that has really limited resources, you don't have lots that you can bring to bear, can you identify what would be sort of the one kind of strategy or program that a local government could try to implement that you think is most important? And I know it's hard because, as you've identified, it's a collection of things. It's affordable housing, it's workforce training, it's community wealth building, but just put on the local government hat and think you don't have much to work with. Where would you advise?
Well, after we're back to semi-normal, I think, but I have not really thought that one through, and it's a tough question because I think there are a couple of different strands. I would think one thing is to, I think, try to see what the local government can do, including whatever it can generate from the private sector and from any federal stimulus and so forth, to help businesses stay open or reopen, because ultimately that's kind of the community's economic lifeline. I think the second is to figure out how best to minimize evictions and mortgage foreclosures, whether it's working with landlords, working with banks, working with tenants and homeowners, putting together whatever packages you can. Financial assistance may be needed, but hopefully just working with people together, getting the banks, simple little things like convincing lenders, instead of demanding their payment immediately, to tack the payment on to the end of the mortgage. explaining to landlords why evicting a tenant who was a well-paying tenant up to now, at this particular moment in time, having an empty apartment at a point when the market is going to be very weak is just not a good idea. To, again, cut tenants slack, to let the process gradually evolve and hopefully heal. Making sure there's enough credit and encouraging people to start buying houses again. Just trying to put a lot of pieces together where you, obviously money would help, is tremendously important, but where by getting people to talk to each other and to work with each other, hopefully with the idea that we're all in it together, I think a local government can have a very profound effect on moving the needle upward and helping us dig ourselves out of this.
Thank you very much, Alan. And speaking of money and we're all in this together, I do just want to remind everyone that C-Clear is dependent in part on you, and part of what makes putting on webinars like this and in-person events, when we can do them again, possible is funding from generous contributors. So I do encourage you to check out our donate page and consider us the next time you're feeling charitable. It does go a long way to putting on educational programming like this, especially at this time when we are really ramping up our online educational programming. Thank you so much, Alan. I do just want to mention that we only scratched the surface with the material in your book. There's lots more questions, answers. There's tons more material, and you can purchase The Divided City on Island Press. And we only touched a little bit on the implications of COVID-19, and so I do just want to mention that Alan will be speaking next on the Center for Community Progress's webinar after the COVID-19 emergency, What's Next for Middle Neighborhoods. You can catch that on Thursday, April 23rd at 12. You will be getting this PowerPoint, so you can just register from this link. Also, please look out for our upcoming webinars. Our next webinar in our Brown Bag Brunch series is Women Innovators in Redevelopment on May 21st at 1. Please look out for registration for that. We will be, we're excited about that one. It's going to be another informal chat that I think you'll enjoy. Once again, thank you so much, Alan, for joining us today. Any questions we didn't get to, we will respond to in time. Again, my name is Claire Weston. I'm the Programs Manager for the Center for Creative Land Recycling, and thank you, Jean, for fielding questions, Deputy Director. We'll sign off now, and we hope you all have a wonderful day and hope to see you soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you.